MGCovers. This is episode 25 of the Underdog Sniper podcast. Greatly appreciate you tuning in. If you're tuning in live, welcome. Appreciate you tuning in live on YouTube. Or if you're watching this replay, listening to this replay on Spotify or Apple. Absolutely love this podcast. It's interesting. Before we start, I have a new habit of reading every morning, and I've learned so much from reading. I just finished this great book, Atomic Habits, where it talks about how to create a habit. And a lot of times a habit that you create is something that you generally need to do, but you don't want to do. But after you create the habit, you look forward to it. And I absolutely look forward to these podcasts. And that was something that I struggled with in the past. But I love this format. I love being consistent with it. And I feel like I have this open platform just to talk about my approach to sports handicapping, things we see in the sports betting space, talk about my models, success and failures. So I just love this format a lot, and I greatly appreciate those of you that are tuning in to listen to this every single week. All right, in this podcast, we got a lot to discuss. We're going to talk about first week in NFL. We will discuss that. We're going to talk about college football as well. We're going to look at the results of the subjective model I had, even the subjective model I had for NFL. And this is really important. We're going to talk about when is the best time to start wagering a new sport, and when is the best time to stop wagering on that sport. So when do you start? What's the best time to start? And at what point do you say, hey, it's time to shut this down and move on? And we're going to use an actual real example, baseball, to look at that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the most undervalued play in sports handicapping. And it's probably going to shock a lot of you guys because it's not as sexy as you would think it would be. All right, so let's dive into, I think I want to first start with college football. Again, this was week 2 of the college football season. And just to give you a little background on what I did, this model that I created, this was called a subjective model, which means we're not actually using stats. Because all we have, if we did use stats, we only have 1 week of stats. Now, this is not the actual model that we'll be using during the regular season. I have an actual true legit statistical model. We'll be using the first 3 weeks, and that will be 100% statistically driven. But to expand, to try to attempt to get better, to improve as a sports handicapper, I wanted to throw out and try this model. I did it last year, and I did the same for NFL, which we'll discuss in this podcast as well. All right, so what I had learned from week 1 was that rather than using a line to establish value, because I gave every single team a line, I ranked every team and gave them a line, so we had a quote legit line. But what I learned, the best way to do it was, or the way I thought to do it, was to play for the quote top teams via the model, and I had a certain criteria that I used. And then secondly, the other way to play it was to play against the quote bottom teams via that model. Now, we had really, really solid results for week 1. However, week 2, listen to these results, and this is fascinating. So for week 2, for that model, playing the top teams went 5-9. And then the bottom teams went 10-12. So it regressed. So we had a winning week on both top teams and bottom teams. Now, here's the interesting part, because we're going to talk about why here in a second. If you combine that data with the first week, playing for the top teams, that means playing the top teams via the model, it went 15-13. So if you factor in juice, assuming -110 juice, it wasn't profitable, basically even. However, playing against the bottom teams, that went 41-29. Now, I'll give you a second just to sort of think about this and process this. Why would playing against the quote bad teams via the model would be more profitable than playing for the top teams? Because if you can understand this will give you an edge in sports betting. And the answer is very obvious once I point this out. Now, I'm going to go through and list all the top teams via the college football model that I had. Penn State did not cover. Pittsburgh covered. Georgia did not cover. Notre Dame lost. Huge upset there. Wisconsin did not cover. Auburn did not cover and lost. Ole Miss, Miami, Alabama, Missouri, LSU, Ohio State, Oregon, USC. Those were all the top teams via the model. Now, as I list all those teams, the majority of those teams were what? Those were perceived to be, quote, good teams. So I posted this on Instagram, and I learned this from my mentor. The way the sports books set lines, it's not necessarily based on a formula. They base the line on market perception of those teams. And a classic example was Georgia. The line for Georgia was minus 55. That's a very difficult number to cover if they were playing a Division II school. Minus 55. Now, I'm not going to call out all the teams we had that we were playing against the bottom teams, but I will give you one example. So just keep that in the back of your head. Georgia was minus 55, very difficult number to cover. Coastal Carolina was playing William and Mary. Coastal Carolina is an FBS school, but they were playing William and Mary, which is an FCS school. Good FCS school, but still, I said this last podcast, are not the same. FBS schools get more scholarship, can give out more scholarships, and of course, obviously recruit better talent. Coastal Carolina was minus 17 against William and Mary. So the question I'll pose to you, if I made you pick between those two plays, and this is a very good exercise to do when you're handicapping sports, is to look at two plays and force yourself to say which is the better play. The better play, off the top of my head, I can't remember who Georgia was playing. Is it better to play Georgia minus 55, or would Coastal Carolina minus 17 be a better play? And obviously, we have the hindsight of the final score because we know Georgia didn't cover and Coastal did cover. But the point is, and this is the key takeaway from this, all of these top teams are overvalued, which means the marketplace perceives these teams to be good. So what does the books do? Books are going to shade that line. And why do they shade it? Because they know they're going to get a ton of money. They could set the number whatever. They could set it minus 45. They could probably set it minus 58. They're still going to get a ton of money on Georgia. So the reason the line, a lot of people think the line is so high because the books are perceiving Georgia to be the better team, but it's actually the opposite of that. They want to ensure they're going to get some money on the opposite side. And therefore, that's why the number's so big. So the big takeaway here is, especially as it relates specifically to this model, best to just focus on playing against the quote bottom teams, because you tend to get more value that way. Because again, I don't know what the final score, we can take a look at it, see what the final score for Coastal was in that one, but I'm pretty sure, let's see here. Week 2, see if I can find it, scroll down. All right, wait a minute. It was 41-20. So that was a tight cover, but a cover nonetheless. But obviously easier to cover that number, not necessarily because of the difference, but it's just the fact that majority of those quote good teams had a big, extremely large number to cover. So therefore, what we learned, especially moving this model into week 3, again, the primary focus will be simply playing against those bottom teams. And again, that's something that I could obviously apply to next year. So when next year rolls around, probably what we'll do, and again, this is just a model we're going to apply for the first 3 weeks of the year, and then we'll switch to the quote statistically driven model. But next year, just focusing on playing against those bottom teams and maybe tweaking it somewhat. So anxious to see how that pans out for week 3. And also too, that's something else to keep in mind as you're moving forward. Generally what the public perceives to be a quote good team it's always going to be overvalued in the marketplace. All right, so let's look at let's go to NFL. And a couple thoughts about NFL. And I said this, I just posted this on Twitter, and I'm going to talk about this at the end of the broadcast as well. But very difficult to handicap this early in the season, and why? We just don't have any data. And some of you say, well, if you got to use line movement. Well, if you use line movement, the problem is the sharps that are generating the line moves, they have the same amount of data that you have, which is basically zero. So extremely difficult to handicap. And I think I had this. All right. So favorites for week 1 NFL season went 9-3. That was straight up. They had one pick 'em, but the dogs actually covered 7-5 ATS. Home teams 8-5 straight up, 7-6 ATS. And the important thing to remember about NFL, you really don't have a home field advantage. You did many years ago, but now not really. Now college football, obviously, because we know home teams win 70% of the time in college football, but that doesn't seem as no surprise, because generally dogs will cover slightly more than the favorites. Now let's go to my actual model. I was going to see if I could pull this up and put this on the screen. All right, yeah, we got it. All right, now we'll review the plays that I had projected for this model. I had Houston. You can see it on the screen. We had Buffalo. We had, let me scroll down, Minnesota and Seattle. Now, what's interesting about those 4 teams that I called out, all 4 of those teams won. However, only one team covered. And let's look at that. Let's see. We had Houston won 29-27. The line was -3. Buffalo won 34-28. Line was 6.5. Hook got us there. We did. Minnesota did win and cover there, 28-6. That line moved, and ironically, line moved against Minnesota, because at one point it was all the way up to what, -2. So that line moved against Minnesota, and that's another reason for line movement. And I think if you went back and looked at opening line versus closing line, it would probably be split down the middle, 50-50. Again, a case for how difficult it is to handicap. And then finally we had, Denver, Seattle. Seattle was 26-20. Line was 6.5. Now, this is interesting because a lot of people say, well, he lost on the hook. However, I told you guys this last week, and this stat was still true this week. Teams that win also cover 80% of the time. Now, granted, on those 4 suggested plays that I had via the model, only one of them won. However, overall, that doesn't change the statistical fact. Teams that won and covered week 1 NFL season, 11-4. So that percentage is 73%. So right on the number. And of course, we got 1 game pending. So that is still true, that teams that win also cover 80% of the time, or you can reverse it and say teams that cover, which will be for dogs, win outright 80% of the time. So you have to remember, when you're dealing with statistical data, that one game you can't take one example and then blanket that over an entire statistical property. Like, for example, let me give you another example, because you'll hear people say this. See if I can find a good one here. Let's see. I was trying to find a dog. Yeah, that would be a good example, the Indianapolis-Houston game. So if somebody was giving me or wanting advice on the Indianapolis before the game started, and they said, hey, I'm looking at playing Indianapolis, I'm thinking about playing them at +3, my recommendation would have been to play them on the money line. And then after the fact, they would have said, wow, we lost. But if we had taken the points, we would have won. Again, that's a classic example and a mistake a lot of people make in this business. They'll look at, you can't take a 1-game sample size, and that doesn't trump the fact, if that makes sense. Because when you're dealing with stats, especially in sports handicapping, everything is generally 55-45, 60-40. Like closing line value, for example. If you beat the closing line, that doesn't mean you'll win 100% of the time. It means that you should probably win more times than you lose if you beat the closing line. Same deal with this stat. So still, if you look at this from a statistical perspective, it's best to play, especially that line of the +3, is to play that on the money line. Because if you believe that team will cover, then there's an 80% chance that they will win outright as well. Now, as far as adjustments to this subjective model, I'm not sure that I would make any. Now, we had one interesting point was, if you look over here on the left side, we had Carolina and the Giants, the bottom two teams, obviously got blown out and didn't cover. And then if we go up here to the top, San Francisco, well, they played tonight. Buffalo won but didn't cover. KC won and covered. And Detroit won and covered. So it looks pretty decent. I don't think I'll make changes as far as how I'm doing it for week 2. It's just one of those cases to where the statistical property kind of went against us. And again, this is very important to disclose. I didn't make any wagers yesterday. And then on Saturday, the only play that I played was actual wager in real dollars. We played, I just had a brain freeze and forgot. We played Pittsburgh money line and that cash, and then we played Auburn -12 and that loss. So we split out. And that's going to segue us into the next point that I'm going to talk about. Yeah, let's talk about the no play. I think this is probably more undervalued than any other concept in sports betting. And again, I made that tweet. I mean, I posted that on Instagram, and then I just retweeted it out on Twitter. Is that the beginning of the year is very, very difficult. It's probably more difficult to handicap at the beginning of the year than it is probably the end of the year. Because at least at the end of the year, even though it's difficult, you still have no data at the beginning of the year. So I know this doesn't sound sexy, but a lot of times and I said this, the majority of people, probably the best play to make on Sunday, which was yesterday, was the no play. Because if you don't wager anything, you don't lose anything. And the way to approach it, the way I look at it is like, look at NFL. You have September, October, November, December. So you got 4 months to turn a profit in that sport. So you got a lot of time, right, to turn a profit. So there's no need to make, quote, basically guesses the beginning of the year and risk, going in the hole, -3 units or whatever. You had 3 plays yesterday, say all 3 lose, and then you're 0-3. And that's why I'm saying for the large majority of people, wagering this early is probably not recommended. Even if you're somebody that's going to be using just a top-down approach where you're going to be no model, but basing the majority of your plays off of line movement, everybody's got the same amount of data. So not saying everybody's guessing, but in essence, they're doing what I'm doing. They have, subjective information, but let's just be realistic. We don't have any like true data that we can actually use, statistical data that's valid. And that's why if you look back, I tell you what, let's do that. Let's go back in the NFL. We're going to look at the line moves and let's see how accurate the line moves for NFL. We'll start with Carolina, San Fran. And what I'll do is, just so you know, let's pull this up so everybody can see it. Oh, that's perfect. All right, so we'll look at Carolina, New Orleans. Line open at +5, closed at 3.5. So that line move favors Carolina, and I'll use Bookmaker. So that was a loss. Tennessee lined open at +4.5, closed at 4. That line move favored Tennessee. They lost. Houston line open at 2.5, moved to 3. They lost. And again, I'm using the closing line. Because if you base it on open, even if you base it on open line, they still lost. But that's how we're going to grade these. So 0-3 with line moves. Buffalo opened at -7, closed at 6.5. That favors Arizona. So the line movement did win there. New England, Cincinnati, big shocker there. New England +9. The line moved all the way down to 7.5. Books were right. Line movement was correct there. Jacksonville, Miami, -4, moved down to 3.5. That favored Jacksonville. Jacksonville did cover, but did not win. And again, we looked at Minnesota, opened at +1, moved down to a pick. So that line movement still favored Minnesota. They won. Pittsburgh, Atlanta, +3, opened, closed at +4. So that line move favored Atlanta. Pittsburgh won. Denver, Seattle, opened at 5, moved up to 6.5. That line favored Seattle. Seattle did not cover. Chargers and Vegas, -4, moved down to -3. That favored Vegas and not the Chargers. Chargers won. Vegas did not. Dallas and Cleveland. Interesting line move here. This line opened at -1, moved to +2 against Dallas, and that was basically a blowout game. And my good old Washington Commanders. Tampa line opened at -4. No move there. So on the no move, we favor the favorite, and they were correct on the line move there. Rams, Detroit. Line opened at -3, closed at -5. Line movement was correct there. Green Bay, Philadelphia, -1.5, opened, favor Philadelphia, moved down to -1. So that favors Green Bay. Philadelphia won. And then we had no movement with KC, -2.5, opened, closed at 2.5. So you can see right there, it was basically like 50-50. So very difficult. But if you give sharps, and myself included, more statistical data, say around week 3 or 4, obviously that will sharpen up. But fascinating. But again, the point to be made there is very difficult to handicap this early in the season. So don't be scared to, and this is true for NHL, it's true for any sport. The first, same deal with NBA. You're probably better off just watching the first 2 weeks. And I know that's hard to do, but this business takes a lot of discipline sometimes, and it's hard to pass on those games when you're excited and your emotions get the best of you. But again, most undervalued play in sports handicapping is the no play. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about is when to start wagering and when to stop wagering. We're going to use this baseball model as an example. We'll take a look at, I don't know if I can pull that. Let me see if I can pull this up. Yeah, I think I can without showing the model. I have to be careful here. Okay, so here we are with, this is Major League Baseball. Still had a great season. 193 wins, 168 losses at plus 35.82 units. However, if you back up to August the 17th, now at the halfway point for Major League Baseball, halfway of the season, we were right around 22 units. And then going to the second half of the season, I said my goal is 40 units. This is very important. 40 units was my goal. However, on August the 17th, or maybe that was, hell, it might have been August the 16th, we ended up hitting 50 units. So we'll start with the second part of that, when to stop wagering on the season. The reason it gets, let me talk about first why it gets difficult to handicap late in the season. It's very difficult to assess motivation with these teams. Meaning some teams know they're going to make the playoffs. Their position might be, and this is true for baseball, football, whatever. They don't know where their position might be, but they know they're going to make the playoffs. So for a lot of teams, motivation is down. Then you have other teams, maybe they have a losing record, but because they know they're not going to make the playoffs, they play loose, they end up winning. You see a lot of that. I referenced the Detroit Red Wings. That might have been the 2019 season, end of the year. And we just rode them for like the last, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 games. They went on this huge tear, and every night they were plus 200, plus 250, plus 235. And they were winning what felt like almost every night. But the point is, it gets very difficult to assess that motivation. And therefore, there comes a point where you're going to have to, quote, shut it down. Now, there's several ways to do this. If you go back to referencing what I said earlier, like I said, hey, my goal is 40 units. So you could just simply say, if and when I hit my goal of 40 units, I'm going to stop. And in retrospect, that's probably what I should have done. Again, I hate saying that because, it's so easy to say I should have done this because you have the hindsight. But at the time, we'd actually gotten it to 52 units. So you're only talking like, I don't know, what was that? Maybe like a week ago. And then you can see here, let me pull it up. It's one on this it's basically a losing skid, which I talked about. And then the last, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 0-7 run there the last 2 days, which was rough, right? Still a positive season. And now at this point, probably what I'm going to do in my focus, I'm probably going to ride this out, because one of the reasons I kept moving forward, and this is important too, is last year, even though this model is different, we still ended up making about 6.5 units, different model, but the model was still sharp all the way to the end of the season. And that was another reason why I went forward. But in retrospect, if I could back up and do this all over again, consider my goal was 40, and we hit 40. Gosh, we hit 40 beginning of August. And then August 17th, we ended up at 50 units. That would have been the time to shut it down, because not only did you hit your goal, you went way beyond that. And what we know about this business is, if you understand regression, meaning in that particular run, I shared this on Facebook, we went through like a 50 game sample of hitting 69%. So if you hit a 50 game sample and you're hitting 69%, it's going to regress. I mean, it's just impossible for it to maintain that. And when I talk about regression, if you're new, it's not going to go down to like 53%. It's going to go well below that to balance out, because everything's always regressing. So if you're hitting 69% through a 50 game sample size, it's going to regress way below that to balance that out. And that's basically what it's done. So the point to be made in this is, when you're figuring out when to stop wagering, is basically having a unit goal, or you can simply have a date, meaning like, so we have basically 3 weeks left of MLB baseball. You could say, hey, I'm going to wager baseball up until the last month, September the 2nd, wherever I'm at, I'm going to cut it off. And that way, that takes all the emotions out. So whether you're up or down, or wherever you're at, you can just stop wagering and, focus on your next sport, whether that be soccer, college football, NFL. But in retrospect, considering the goal was only 40 units and we got it all the way to 50 units, that's probably when I should have shut it down. But now, looking at this situation, I would give the same advice if somebody was listening to this, but somebody was asking me for advice. Consider now we went through all this regression. I'm going to probably continue to wager here for the next 3 weeks, because obviously it has nowhere to go but up from that point. And hopefully we can get it back to 40 units. And then I would finish the year hitting the actual goal. And then the front part about that, when to start wagering on a season, and I talked about this earlier, I would say, like for NFL and college football, after you have about 3 weeks, I think that's a decent sample size to start. Because if you just have, 2 games, I think that's difficult. And we've always said that about NFL and college football. You have a very limited sample size. But I would say after 3 weeks for NFL and college football season, and then for your sports that have longer seasons, like Major League Baseball, NBA, college basketball, probably 10 games is a good time to start, because that way you have, if you're running a model, you have sufficient statistical data. And if you're, using a top-down approach, piggybacking off those sharps, then, all those sharps are, have 10 games, or in the case with NFL, have, 3 weeks of data. So anyway, so that's, so that's a wrap for episode 25 of the podcast. Greatly appreciate you guys listening in. I will mention something. I am working diligently on this new coaching program. Super excited about it. So it's going to be 70% of it will be online learning. 30% of it will be maybe like coaching via Zoom. So it's going to be a very faster, more efficient way to learn how to build models. If you're interested in getting more information about that, you can click the link. Should be a link in this, regardless of what platform you're watching on. But again, greatly appreciate you guys